I was halfway through an afternoon shift at a small graphic design firm in Chicago when my phone buzzed insistently. At first, I assumed it was a routine notification or a spam call, but then I saw the name, Tony Carroll, Colorado. The weight behind that name made my heart thump. Tony wasn't just any family friend, he was practically my uncle by affection. He and my grandparents had shared land boundaries in rural Colorado for decades, swapping stories, equipment, and neighborly favors. I hadn't heard from Tony in over a year, and my mind raced as I picked up. Before I could even say hello, he launched into a tirade of words so frantic that I barely caught his meaning. "Kid, you'd better get down here right away," Tony said, voice trembling. "They're ripping up your grandpa's ranch, I'm serious. Bulldozers, a construction crew, the whole 9 yards. Some fancy HOA name I never heard of. Looks like they're building some high-end development right in your pastures." I froze. My family's ranch, the only real inheritance Grandpa left me, was being torn to pieces by strangers? "Tony, what do you mean? That land's still in my name. I never sold a thing." He sounded distraught. "They're showing off permits, county records saying they own a big chunk of your property. I called the sheriff, but they just shrugged and said it's all official. I tried telling him it belongs to you, but they claim otherwise. You'd better come see for yourself before it's all gone." My heart kicked into gear. I hastily saved my work, stammered an excuse to my boss about a family emergency, and headed straight home to pack a bag. During the hectic drive to the airport, a storm of questions swirled in my head. How could anyone claim ownership of my family's ranch? Could Grandpa's final wishes be overridden so easily? I recalled with a jolt of memory the battered old trunk in Grandpa's study. He used to keep important papers in a metal strongbox tucked away inside. I'd never bothered to open it after inheriting the ranch. Maybe that was a mistake. Within hours, I was on a flight from O'Hare to Denver, adrenaline making it impossible to sit still. While the plane roared through the clouds, I stared out the small window, remembering Grandpa's voice. He always told me, "Never let them push you off your own land, kid." It was just an expression for him, some old-fashioned piece of advice about self-reliance. But maybe he'd suspected that greedy forces would eventually come sniffing around, trying to transform family farmland into commercial gold. When I landed, I rented a pickup truck and made the 3-hour drive to what used to be a quiet pocket of Colorado countryside. The terrain was familiar, yet jarringly changed. Billboards dotted the highway, promising new luxury living and upscale neighborhood vibes. The closer I got to my grandfather's property, the more these signs popped up like brazen flags of conquest. Horizon Crest, Silver Pine Estate, and then the one that practically stabbed me in the heart, Horizon Bluff, a premier community for the discerning homeowner. That final sign had an arrow pointing down a gravel road, the same road that led to Grandpa's ranch. My jaw tightened. I could see the glow of floodlights in the distance, the silhouettes of heavy machinery. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled onto the property, which was now alarmingly transformed into a construction site. Where once I remembered rolling fields and wooden fences, I now saw churned-up earth, half-built model homes, and materials piled in neat stacks. I parked near a freshly mounted sign that read "Private Property Authorized Personnel Only." A security guard approached, shining a flashlight at my face. "Stop there, sir. This is an active development zone. Do you have business here?" Anger surged in my chest. "I'm the owner," I snapped, "or at least I thought I was. This is my grandfather's ranch, and I inherited it." The guard gave me a disbelieving smirk. "You might want to speak with the HOA rep. As far as we know, Horizon Bluff Estates owns this land. Are you sure you're in the right place?" I grit my teeth, forcing myself to remain calm. "You'd better get whoever's in charge. I'm not leaving until I get an explanation." He shrugged, pulled out a walkie-talkie, and murmured a few words. Moments later, a tall woman in a tailored blazer strode up, looking annoyed at having her evening interrupted. She introduced herself as Diane, the chair of the Horizon Bluff Homeowners Association. Her smile was more condescending than friendly. So you're the one claiming ownership. We've seen your name on some outdated records, but we have official surveys and rezoned deeds that say otherwise. Rage flared in my gut. Since when can you just rezone a privately owned ranch? Diane glanced around at the bulldozers and construction lights. There's a process, obviously. Everything we've done is on the up and up. We purchased a portion of this property from the recognized deed holder of record. I'm sorry if you missed the notices or got your wires crossed, but we're breaking no laws here. Her tone was far too slick, too certain. I wanted to scream at her, but a small voice in my mind said to keep my cool. I've never sold a single acre to anyone, I said through gritted teeth. Whatever you have is a forgery or a mistake. Diane rolled her eyes in practiced exasperation. You're free to hire an attorney and challenge it if you wish, but I'll be honest, our HOA has extensive resources. If you push this, it's likely to be a painful legal slog. No one's trying to cheat you out of anything. Maybe you'd prefer a buyout. We're open to a settlement. My hands curled into fists at my sides. I don't want a settlement. I want you off my land. She brushed an imaginary speck off her blazer. Then I guess we'll see you in court. Have a lovely evening. With that, she turned on her heel and marched away, leaving me seething under the glare of the construction lamps. I found Tony Carroll at the edge of the site, leaning on his old pickup, arms folded tightly across his chest. The expression he wore was a mixture of despair and apology. I'm sorry, kid, he said the moment he saw me. I tried to stop him, or at least slow him down, but they said you'd signed it away. I knew that was nonsense, but the sheriff said the permits looked official. I put a hand on his shoulder, managing a grim smile. Not your fault, Tony. I'm glad you called me. I gazed across the once familiar pasture. Dust and debris rose in the air, illuminated by harsh artificial light. The sight made my stomach knot. I'm going to fight this, I said softly. They're not getting away with it. He gave a weary nod. I figured you would. I resolved to drive into town, stay at a cheap motel, and visit the county recorder's office first thing in the morning. Tony suggested that I also dig through Grandpa's strongbox. He recalled Grandpa mentioning it more than once, as though it contained vital documents for the day someone tried to snatch our family's land. At the time, it had sounded paranoid. Now, it seemed more like a prescient warning. That night in the motel, I barely slept. I kept replaying Diane's smug face in my mind, the confident glint in her eyes that said she'd done this before. My phone buzzed with messages from old neighbors who'd gotten wind of the scandal. Some offered sympathy, others urged me to stand firm. A few recalled how the Hendersons, a local family, lost a chunk of their farmland not long ago under suspicious circumstance. I wondered if Diane had been involved there too, or if it was just a grim coincidence. At dawn, I drove to the old ranch house itself, miraculously untouched so far. The building was worn around the edges, but it still felt like home in the midst of an alien landscape. I walked through the dusty living room, running a hand over old pictures on the mantel. Grandpa's photo stared back, forever wearing that half-smile under his broad-brimmed hat. I found my way to his study at the back, where an ancient roll-top desk sat against the wall. Underneath it was the trunk, and inside the trunk, secured by a hefty lock, was the strongbox Tony had mentioned. I hunted around for the key. Grandpa once told me he kept it taped beneath a loose floorboard in the kitchen. Sure enough, after some searching, I felt the small metal key under the board. Returning to the study, I opened the strongbox. The smell of old paper rose to greet me. Inside lay a stack of documents sealed in plastic bags, an old spiral notebook with Grandpa's scrawl, and a manila envelope labeled Property Boundaries. My heart hammered as I read. The first few pages were old survey maps from the 1960s, showing the precise lines of the ranch, annotated with notes Grandpa had made over the decades. The boundary was crystal clear. It included every inch of the land Diane's construction crew was now tearing up. Then I flipped to a typed letter Grandpa had signed, addressed to It read, in part, "I suspect one day this ranch may be targeted by big money folks looking to turn a profit on farmland. If that day comes, don't believe any fancy talk or fast deals. This property's ours, and these old surveys prove it. Keep them safe, and don't let them bully you out of your heritage." I had to blink back tears. He'd seen this coming, and I'd never bothered to ask him more about it while he was alive. I leafed through more materials, references to county deeds, mention of local officials Grandpa distrusted, and notes on how to challenge fraudulent claims. It was like he'd preloaded a whole blueprint to handle exactly this crisis. I felt a surge of both gratitude and regret. I wished I could thank him for his foresight in person. By mid-morning, I drove into the county seat and headed straight to the clerk and recorder's office. Rows of file cabinets lined the walls, and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A tired-looking clerk approached. She introduced herself as Mary. I told her my name and said I needed to see the official records on my ranch, specifically any recent changes to the deeds or boundaries. She directed me to a seat while she went to fetch the documents. When she came back, Mary held a folder with a stack of forms, each bearing multiple stamps and signatures. "It says here that part of the property was sold to the Horizon Bluff HOA about 8 months ago," Mary explained. "They filed boundary adjustments with the county, which were approved by the commissioners." I stared at the pages in disbelief, scanning them until I found a signature that was supposed to be mine. I felt a cold flush run through me. The signature was similar, but it wasn't the way I wrote my name. "This is a forgery," I muttered, anger tightening my throat. "I never signed anything like this." Mary frowned sympathetically. "I've been hearing rumors about more and more farmland being sold for development, and some owners claimed they never signed anything. But it's tough to prove forgeries unless you bring in experts. The county commissioners insisted the documents were above board, so we processed them." My mind raced with possibilities. Was there an inside job at the county level? Had Diane bribed someone to sign off on these fraudulent documents? It wasn't unheard of. Corruption can lurk in the most unassuming places. "Thank you, Mary," I said quietly, gathering copies of everything. "I'm going to get these analyzed by a lawyer." She gave me a kind, apologetic look. "I hope you can sort this out. I've always admired your grandfather's ranch. It'd be a shame to see it turned into another cookie-cutter subdivision." I stepped out of the office onto the sidewalk, the midday sun blinding me momentarily. In my hands was the smoking gun, proof that something shady had gone on. Now I just needed to muster the legal might to fight back. I called up an attorney recommended by a friend, Sam Whitaker, a local lawyer known for tackling land disputes. Over the phone, Sam sounded intrigued by my case and told me to bring the documents over immediately. His office was a modest one-story building in the older part of town. Inside, Sam greeted me with a weathered handshake and led me to a small conference room. I spread out Grandpa's original surveys alongside the suspicious new ones from the clerk's office. Sam wore thin, wire-rimmed glasses and peered down at the pages for a long minute without speaking. Finally, he exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is sloppy forgery," he muttered. "But that doesn't mean it won't hold up if the county's already recognized it. We can prove it's fraudulent, but we'll need a handwriting expert. We'll likely have to file an injunction to freeze all construction while we investigate." I nodded. "That's exactly what I want. If they keep bulldozing, they'll destroy every physical landmark that confirms my boundaries." Sam pulled out a notepad, scribbling furiously. "We'll approach a judge for a temporary restraining order, but with these big HOAs, expect a fight. They have lawyers on retainer, probably connected to local officials. This Diane figure, she's a heavy hitter around here." "I noticed," I said dryly. Sam pressed his lips together. "I'll do everything in my power. But you have to be prepared for legal fees, stalling tactics, intimidation. They'll try to wear you down." I stared at Grandpa's meticulous handwriting in the old notebook, recalling how he always said, "We Jacobs folks don't run from trouble. We stand our ground." That was all I needed. "I'm ready," I said firmly. Sam nodded. "All right, let's get this ball rolling." I left his office with a swirl of optimism and dread in my stomach. Tony Carroll had offered me a spare room in his place for as long as I needed. He lived about 5 miles away from the ranch, on a smaller property dotted with a few horses and goats. That afternoon, as I settled into Tony's guest room, I heard the distant rumble of thunder. Or maybe it was just the echo of more heavy equipment tearing up the land. The next morning, Sam filed our initial paperwork, asking the county court to grant an injunction halting construction until a formal hearing could be held on the boundary dispute. We also arranged for a handwriting analysis of my alleged signature. Diane, apparently tipped off, wasted no time in retaliating. By the end of the day, I received a thick envelope from her legal team, claiming that my challenge was frivolous and threatening to countersue me for damages if I continued interfering with their legitimate development. At first, I felt a pang of intimidation, but I also felt a surge of righteous anger. This was my land, my family's legacy. If they thought they could bully me with fancy legal jargon, they were mistaken. I was in it for the long haul. Sam set up a meeting with an independent surveyor, a middle-aged woman named Jean who arrived in a Jeep stuffed with equipment. She spent a whole day walking the property, cross-referencing Grandpa's documents with the official county records. By evening, she confirmed that the boundary lines recognized by the HOA were definitely not aligned with the original surveys. According to her measurements, the new lines carved out a substantial piece of the ranch, particularly the portion closest to the main road, for the luxury development. It was prime land, easy to access, and no doubt valuable. Jean scratched her head, flipping through her notes. "There's no legitimate reason for these lines to shift by that much, especially without you, the rightful owners, signing off in person." I felt a bitter satisfaction. "So, it's conclusive. They're trespassing." She gave a cautious shrug. "That's for the court to decide, but from a purely surveying standpoint, your claim is much stronger than theirs." The next step was presenting this evidence in a legal setting, but every time Sam tried to expedite the hearing, we hit a bureaucratic wall. The local judge, who was rumored to be chummy with certain developers, kept pushing the date further out. Meanwhile, Diane's construction crews continued to expand, pouring foundations, erecting frames, laying down asphalt for roads. It was maddening. We needed that injunction desperately, or everything might be lost. Then, the harassment started. One evening, I drove over to the ranch house, still standing, though the yard around it was a maze of construction detritus, and found the electricity had been cut. The utility company insisted it was due to maintenance, but refused to give details. A couple of nights later, the water supply was mysteriously shut off as well. Tony and I discovered that my old well pump had been tampered with. Both times I reported it to the local authorities, but nothing came of it. I also started getting citations in the mail for bogus infractions, unsafe structure notices on a barn that had stood for decades, or an unregistered septic system that had never been a problem before. It was clear Diane and her allies were pulling every lever to bury me under fines and legal nightmares, hoping I'd fold or sell. But Grandpa's face in my mind kept me going, his stoic pride, his unwavering love for the land. I refused to walk away. During all this turmoil, I found unexpected allies in the local community. A group of neighbors banded together, sharing stories of how the HOA had tried to pressure them into selling or adjusting boundaries. Some had caved to the intimidation, others were still putting up a fight. Word spread, and soon we formed a small coalition, meeting occasionally at a nearby diner. We brainstormed how to challenge the rising wave of spurious developments. A local reporter, Melissa Andrews, caught wind of our gatherings and started attending as well, sniffing around for a scandalous story. The first time Melissa showed up at the ranch, she was appalled by the stark contrast between the untouched portion of farmland and the raw, half-constructed development. She interviewed me, Tony, and a few other neighbors, capturing footage of the bulldozers in the background. "I'll do my best to shed light on this," she said. "People need to know about shady deals that put farmland at risk." A small segment aired on the local news, showing a clip of me holding Grandpa's original deed and pointing out the mismatch with the county's records. Diane refused an on-camera interview, providing only a written statement claiming I was mistaken and that the HOA had followed every legal procedure. Still, public sentiment began to shift. People started questioning the county commissioners, who squirmed under scrutiny. That pressure finally forced a hearing date to be set, though it was still weeks away. In the meantime, the construction marched on at a blistering pace. Frustration gnawed at me daily as I watched new houses take shape where my family's cattle once grazed. Every day the horizon changed more, the open sky filling with rooftops and scaffolding. Sam and I had one ace up our sleeve, the whistleblower in the county clerk's office. A friend of a friend approached Sam discreetly, offering to leak emails showing that certain commissioners had fast-tracked approvals for Horizon Bluff, skipping required environmental assessments and forging land transfer documents. It was the smoking gun we needed, undeniable proof that the HOA and crooked officials were collaborating. But it was also dangerous. If we released those emails prematurely, the whistleblower could lose their job or face retaliation. We decided to wait until the court hearing to reveal everything at once. The day of the hearing arrived like a thunderstorm, swift, tense, and full of electricity in the air. The small courtroom was packed with onlookers, reporters, and a few uniformed cops stationed at the doors. Diane sat flanked by 3 attorneys in sharp suits. She wore her usual calm, superior smile, as if this were just another step in her unstoppable plan. I sat next to Sam, my stomach twisting in knots, Grandpa's strongbox documents in a leather binder at my feet. The judge, a heavyset man with thinning hair, called the session to order. Sam presented our argument first, walking the court through the original deed, the independent surveys, and the suspicious nature of my supposed signature. He then detailed how multiple neighbors had reported intimidation and borderline illegal pressures from the HOA. Diane's attorneys did everything possible to object, calling our evidence circumstantial and unsubstantiated. They insisted the county's official records couldn't be wrong. Then Sam mentioned the possibility of forged or altered county records, requesting permission to submit new evidence under seal to protect the identity of a whistleblower. Diane's composure cracked for a split second, and her attorneys huddled, whispering anxiously. The judge allowed the sealed documents, and Sam handed them over. He explained that these emails indicated direct collusion between Diane, her associates, and certain county commissioners to push the boundary changes through. The hush in the courtroom felt electric. Everyone sensed a big revelation was at hand. The judge looked increasingly concerned as he skimmed the leaked emails. Diane's team scrambled, calling it hearsay or an invasion of privacy, but the judge declared that the evidence was relevant to the matter at hand and needed proper examination. He scheduled a follow-up session to review the emails in detail. Meanwhile, he granted our request for a temporary injunction to halt all further construction until the matter was resolved. Diane's attorneys objected with gusto, claiming their clients would suffer massive financial losses, but the judge held firm. For the moment, I'd won a significant battle. Construction would stop and the county's role in the scheme would undergo intense scrutiny. Outside the courthouse, camera crews and onlookers swarmed me. Melissa from the local news asked how I felt about the injunction. "Relieved," I said, though I was trembling inside. "This fight isn't just about me. It's about everyone who values farmland and can't stand by while corruption paves it over." For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly that night. Early the next morning, I drove out to the ranch, expecting to find the place quiet at last. Indeed, the bulldozers and construction crews were gone. Where they'd previously roared day and night, now there was an eerie silence. It was almost worse, seeing the partially built homes standing like skeletal remains of a hostile invasion. The land looked scarred. Still, the injunction was a respite, a chance to breathe and gather more evidence. Of course, Diane and her group didn't sit idle. Over the next few days, I received a barrage of legal papers, countersuits alleging defamation, breach of contract, and even malicious interference with a lawful development. Their claims were absurd, but responding to each one required time, money, and emotional energy. Sam cautioned me to stay calm. "They're trying to bury you in paperwork," he said. "They figure if they drag this out, maybe you'll settle." But I wasn't going to settle, not after seeing my grandfather's barns half crushed and my birthright used as a staging ground for overpriced homes. The solidarity from neighbors strengthened my resolve. They rallied around me, offering help with paperwork, and many even wrote letters to local newspapers detailing their experiences with the HOA's intimidation tactics. When the follow-up court date arrived, the stakes felt even higher. Diane's attorneys had spent weeks trying to get the whistleblower's evidence tossed on technicalities. Sam was more than prepared. He laid out the chain of custody for the emails and underscored the authenticity verified by digital forensics. Then he called the whistleblower to the stand, anonymously, behind a privacy screen to protect their identity from the public. The whistleblower testified that they witnessed commissioners receiving questionable payments disguised as campaign contributions from the HOA. Emails explicitly discussed forging my signature, along with forging other landowners' signatures in similar deals. My stomach churned as I listened. The levels of brazen corruption were worse than I'd imagined. Diane's name appeared repeatedly in these messages, instructing officials to fast-track any surveys we submit and to ignore extraneous claims from outsiders. If there had been any doubt before, it evaporated now. Even the judge seemed taken aback. He announced that the court would consider not just an injunction on the ranch, but a possible criminal referral to higher authorities for the commissioners and any HOA leaders implicated in the document falsifications. Diane's lawyers looked pale. Diane herself clenched her jaw, sending me a furious glance that practically spelled out, "I'll make you pay." A wave of relief washed over me as the judge reaffirmed the injunction. Further, he signaled that ownership of the contested land was leaning heavily in my favor. However, he wanted a final, thorough hearing to establish all damages and potential restitution. That hearing would take more time to schedule, but I had the upper hand. Construction on the ranch was now frozen indefinitely. Outside, I was bombarded by reporters again. Some asked if I felt vindicated, others if I was afraid of retribution. I answered honestly, "I'm just glad the truth is coming to light. My family didn't leave me this land just so a group of crooks could snatch it away. This is a win for everyone who cares about fairness." In the following weeks, the scandal exploded. Multiple county commissioners resigned or were suspended pending investigation. News outlets from beyond the local area picked up the story of forged deeds and an HOA gone rogue, shining a spotlight on Diane. Investors who had poured money into Horizon Bluff Estates began pulling out, seeing the project as toxic. Prospective homebuyers demanded refunds of their deposits, not wanting to be tangled in an illegal fiasco. Diane tried to mount a PR campaign, releasing statements that she was shocked by the allegations and blaming rogue employees for any forged documents, but the emails showed she had personally directed the entire scheme. The more she tried to squirm free, the more evidence emerged tying her to each crooked transaction. Eventually, her own legal team seemed to be in damage control, less about saving Horizon Bluff and more about minimizing Diane's criminal liability. For me, it was a surreal time. On one hand, I felt validated. My stance was proven correct, and the public now knew I wasn't just a disgruntled ranch kid trying to block progress. On the other hand, it was exhausting. Even with the tides turning, Sam and I had mountains of legal details to sift through. We prepared for the final hearing, which would determine not only the ranch's rightful ownership, but also potential punitive damages. I spent countless hours photographing the construction damage, cataloging how many fences were torn down, how many old barns were partially destroyed. It was heartbreaking to see the toll on the land. During this period, neighbors rallied together, helping me repair what we could. We gathered to prop up half-collapsed fences, salvage reusable lumber from the demolished barn, and plant new seeds in trampled fields. Some environmental groups visited too, pointing out that the ranch's creek was at risk of contamination from the incomplete construction. They began advocating for stricter regulations on future developments, citing this fiasco as a cautionary tale. The local mood transformed from weary resignation to fiery determination. The people in town, many of whom had been bullied by the HOA or disillusioned by local government, felt a renewed sense of power. They saw that one determined individual, armed with evidence and a willingness to stand up, could challenge what looked like an unstoppable force. Finally, the day of the decisive hearing arrived. This time, the courtroom was even more packed, with some folks standing along the back wall. Diane appeared, flanked by two new lawyers. Her old ones had apparently distanced themselves. Her expression was tight, and her usual smugness had evaporated. Sam and I sat confidently, aided by a half-dozen neighbors who offered to testify about the HOA's intimidation tactics. The judge entered and laid out the plan. We'd discuss final boundary determinations, the authenticity of my original deed, the extent of property damage, and possible penalties for the HOA. Sam first recapped our evidence, from the historical surveys to the forged documents to the whistleblower emails. He presented new statements from neighbors detailing how Diane had personally threatened them with legal action or cut off services if they didn't comply. Diane's lawyers tried to claim their client was unaware of any wrongdoing, pointing fingers at the commissioners and rogue employees. But the judge cut them short, citing multiple direct emails from Diane. With each damning piece of evidence, I could practically hear the last threads of her defense snapping. When the judge finally gave his ruling, it felt like the entire room was holding its collective breath. He acknowledged the ranch's rightful boundaries as matching Grandpa's original deed, declared the HOA's claims void, and ordered the immediate cessation of all activity on my land. Diane was found civilly liable for damages. Additionally, he referred possible criminal charges to the state attorney general for the forged deeds and corruption. The hush that followed was profound. Then an eruption of excited chatter swept the room. I barely heard anything else until I felt Tony Carroll grabbing my shoulders, shaking me gently and beaming. "You did it, kid," he said in a hoarse whisper. "You saved the ranch." Later, outside the courthouse, the local news once again surrounded me. I repeated that it wasn't just me, it was my grandfather's foresight, an honest lawyer, a courageous whistleblower, and a community that refused to be silenced. This victory, though it felt personal, was really a collective one. Over the next few weeks, as the legal dust settled, the county commissioners who had resigned were replaced by newly appointed officials who vowed increased transparency. Diane found herself named in multiple lawsuits, and eventually she vanished from the local scene, rumored to have left the state altogether. Horizon Bluff Estates collapsed as a viable project. Investors sued the HOA, prospective buyers demanded restitution, and the brand itself became so tarnished that no one wanted to touch it. I stood on the ranch one afternoon, staring at the half-finished houses. The sound of silence was haunting. Without construction crews, these structures remained eerie silhouettes. The land around them looked scraped bare, as if wounded. Still, I felt triumphant knowing I had a legal green light to tear them down and restore the pastures. It would be a hefty undertaking, but I'd manage it somehow. Neighbors banded together just as they had throughout the fight, volunteering to help demolish the incomplete buildings. Word spread, and soon it turned into a community project. People who I hadn't even met showed up with tools and trucks, determined to see farmland reclaimed. It felt cathartic, dismantling the unauthorized shells that had tainted the horizon. The county's new commissioners also pledged funds to assist with land rehabilitation, especially to clean up potential environmental hazards left by the partial development. My ranch became a kind of symbol, a testament to what can happen when ordinary folks unite against power-hungry organizations. I spent countless evenings back in Grandpa's study, sorting through the strongbox documents, archiving them carefully in a fireproof cabinet. Sometimes I'd flip through his spiral notebook, reading his notes on crop rotations, rainfall patterns, and the best times to plant alfalfa. Interspersed among practical farming tips were lines of wisdom, like, "Land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land." It felt like he was still guiding me, reminding me of my responsibilities. Eventually, I decided to stay in Colorado for the long run. My job in Chicago was understanding enough to let me handle remote freelance work while I supervised the ranch's restoration. The first big task was rebuilding the barn that had been knocked down early in the HOA's construction. Neighbors helped raise a new frame, reminiscent of the old design but modernized for the future. I nailed a small plaque inside that read, "In memory of Grandpa," to honor the man whose foresight saved our land from ruin. Over time, the ranch regained its familiar rhythm. The fields turned green again, fences were mended, and the noise of heavy machinery gave way to the soft rustle of grass in the wind. I started keeping a few horses, a handful of chickens, and considered reintroducing cattle. Each sunrise over those rolling acres felt like a renewed promise that the land was safe in my care, just as Grandpa had intended. But the story didn't end with my little corner of Colorado. The revelations about forged deeds and shady rezoning triggered broader investigations. Other landowners filed lawsuits against different HOAs, suspecting they'd been victimized in the same way. Environmental groups used the scandal as a rallying cry for stricter development regulations. Local newspapers ran a series of exposés on how unchecked corruption can metastasize when nobody speaks out. I was invited to speak at a community forum, sharing my experience of standing up to powerful interests. I felt nervous, but also proud. Standing at that podium, I recounted how close I'd come to losing everything, how Grandpa Strongbox had provided the missing puzzle pieces, and how neighbors had formed the backbone of my resistance. The crowd included farmers, ranchers, city dwellers, people from all walks of life. They applauded the moral of the story, that perseverance, evidence, and community support can unravel even the tightest web of deceit. At the forum's end, a young man approached me, tears brimming in his eyes. He said his family owned a small orchard on the outskirts of town, and an HOA had recently claimed half of it via suspicious boundary adjustments. He'd been about to give up, feeling overwhelmed, but after hearing my tale, he felt emboldened. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I realize now there's a chance to fight back." I walked away from that encounter realizing Grandpa's legacy wasn't just about one ranch. His documents, his example, and the shared effort of all those who supported me were sparking a chain reaction of hope. The fight I'd waged was bigger than my personal stake. It was part of a broader stand against bullying and corruption. Over the following months, I found a deeper peace than I'd ever known. I'd wake up early, step out onto the porch with a mug of coffee, and listen to the breeze rustle through the new orchard saplings I'd planted. That orchard was a dream Grandpa always had. Rows of apple and peach trees thriving in the Colorado sun. Now, with the threat of bulldozers gone, I could finally nurture that vision. In the late afternoons, I'd often walk the boundary line, checking fences and feeling the crunch of dry grass under my boots. That line, once so casually accepted, had become a symbol of everything we fought for. Each fence post felt like a marker of defiance, a refusal to let greed overwrite the memories and traditions that shaped my family. Diane eventually faced legal repercussions. She was charged with conspiracy, document forgery, and a slew of other violations, including bribery of public officials. The headlines that once heralded Horizon Bluff Estates as a hallmark of progress now chronicled Diane's downfall. Rumor had it she tried to negotiate a deal by naming other complicit individuals, but the damage to her reputation was irreversible. That suited me just fine. I'd shed enough sleepless nights and anxious mornings fighting her campaign of lies. At the end of it all, I remember a crisp fall morning when Tony Carroll and a few other neighbors joined me for a small celebration. We roasted barbecue in the newly rebuilt barn, played guitar, and told stories of how Grandpa used to welcome travelers off the main road for a hearty meal. We laughed about how, in some ways, Grandpa had set a trap for unscrupulous developers by hiding the evidence they'd never expect. As dusk arrived, turning the sky shades of purple and gold, I stepped out to the pasture alone. My breath caught at the sight of the land rolling gently into the horizon, the silhouette of the barn etched against the last glimmer of daylight. A few months ago, that skyline was dominated by menacing machinery. Now it was whole again, scarred but healing. Standing there, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Grandpa's foresight, for Tony's heads-up call, for Sam's steadfast legal work, for the neighbors who refused to cower. Gratitude for everyone who wrote letters, staged protests, or simply said, "We believe you." It was that united front that tipped the scales from despair to victory. As a gentle breeze rolled across the fields, I closed my eyes and thought about the deeper meaning behind this entire ordeal. The ranch was saved, but beyond that, a community had awakened. People realized that even a seemingly unstoppable force, a well-funded HOA with political connections, can be dismantled when truth and solidarity stand in its way. That realization extended to other corners of the county, inspiring people to reevaluate development deals and hold local officials accountable. It struck me then that the real lesson was about the power of collective spirit. Yes, the evidence was crucial, but it was the community rallying together that truly clinched the win. Alone, I might have been crushed under legal fees and intimidation, but with each new ally stepping forward, each new piece of testimony or signature on a petition, we built a barricade Diane and her cronies couldn't break. It reminded me of an old adage Grandpa liked to quote, "A lone stick can snap, but a bundle of sticks stands firm." The night after our little barn gathering, I sat on the porch steps, gazing at a sky studded with stars. A chorus of crickets provided the soundtrack. In that moment, the ranch felt timeless, as if it had always been this peaceful and always would be. I whispered a quiet thanks to Grandpa, certain that wherever he was, he knew his legacy was intact. I also thought about the orchard which I'd carefully started planting near the creek. Maybe in a few years it would bear fruit for neighbors to enjoy, or for a roadside stand that welcomed visitors. There was something poetic about creating new life in the exact spot where the HOA had once planned to lay concrete and metal pipes. It felt like a final triumph, nature reclaiming space from those who only saw dollar signs. In the end, if I were to share one key takeaway from this entire journey, it's that persistence, truth, and unity can prevail against even the most imposing adversaries. Greed thrives in darkness, in forged documents and hidden deals, but once you shine a spotlight on it, once you refuse to back down and gather others who share your conviction, the tide begins to shift. So yes, the HOA tried to build their luxury community over my family ranch, forging papers and twisting rules. And yes, they almost got away with it. But Grandpa's strong box, some unwavering neighbors, a determined lawyer, and the unstoppable force of community support all combined to flip the script. We exposed the fraud, halted the construction, and reclaimed the land that had been my family's lifeblood for generations. That night on the porch, I felt at peace. The ranch stretched out before me, alive with the gentle rhythms of nature, not the clanking of bulldozers. I could finally inhale without that knot of worry in my chest. As the stars shimmered overhead, I reminded myself of a final truth. We are temporary custodians of the places we call home. It's our duty to guard them, not just for ourselves, but for the future and for the memory of those who came before us. When we do that, when we act as stewards instead of owners, we tap into a deeper well of strength. We remember our connections to the land, to each other, to tradition. We recall that no matter how powerful or wealthy an opponent might be, they cannot erase a legacy built on integrity and shared commitment. That's the real moral. Stand by what's right, stand with your community, and even the mightiest tower of greed can come crashing down.